to talk to you about why men travel farther than women, usually, and whether and why that might have something to do with sex differences in wayfinding and spatial ability. And I guess my first caveat will be that this talk is really by the Spatial Cognition and Navigation group. It's a multidisciplinary group. I'm PI on the project. My main role is to sort of keep all the trains hopefully headed off into the same station. So I will introduce the people who are the main leads of the different studies I'm going to talk about, which will be 3 of them as I go. But it's really a group effort. And so we are psychologists, anthropologists, geographers looking at this. And okay. Right. So it's been known for a long time that there is a male advantage in spatial ability, some spatial ability tasks. Anyway, not all of them. And less clear evidence, but some evidence that males may have a different wayfinding strategy and in some cases do better at it in certain kinds of tasks. And so there are things about this that strike many of us as an evolved adaptation. And so it's a hypothesis we're going to entertain, perhaps an assumption we're going to entertain in order to see how much it can explain. Some of the reasons for thinking that is that it is found across a wide range of taxa, polygynous species. Like other sexually selected traits, it seems to be affected by androgens in utero and possibly later on through adrenarchy. It is found with some variation cross-culturally. And so the question is, it sort of smells like an adaptation to a lot of people. The question is, an adaptation to what? And so what a lot of people would argue, and I guess a lot of people, and Ed and I are going to have to debate this afterwards because I know he's thrown a well-aimed brick at this whole idea, but we can talk about that later. A lot of people are focusing on travel, on navigation. If you're going to, anything that's mobile needs to navigate, it needs to know where it's going and how to find resources. And it is reasonable to expect then that the greater the navigational challenges, the stronger the selection pressure for good spatial ability. All right? So with that, then, let me go to some background, and then I will try and talk to you about, the prior situation. If they're related, then why are males traveling farther? So some things we think we know. Men travel farther than women cross-culturally, and there's variation in it. I'm going to talk to you about some of that variation. My working assumption is, and has always been, that evolution shapes not just modal patterns, but it shapes the nature of how we react to context. It shapes the reaction norms, and we want to understand that also. Boys travel farther than girls from the age of about 8. It's connected with adrenarchy and probably other sex differences that emerge at that time. And the differences are large, like boys will often travel twice as far as girls. You find this in Whiting and Edwards' cross-cultural study, also in Western societies. Also, universal as far as my own data go, we are looking at, by the way, 6 field sites. We're also doing lab studies with virtual navigation. In all of them we've looked at thus far, females seem to be more spatially anxious. They're worried about getting lost, which doesn't say anything about ability. It just says that, as in other areas, women are more fearful. And perhaps less obviously, so this will take a bit of explanation, women and men seem to navigate using different strategies. And the evidence for this, I think, is stronger than the evidence that men are better navigators. It's a matter of paying attention to different kinds of things. In the literature, both, sort of neurocognitive literature, people have distinguished 2 kinds of navigation strategies. You can have what is sometimes called a sort of a survey strategy or orientation strategy. It's kind of a bird's eye view of where things are so that you know where things are relative to each other no matter where you are sitting, kind of map-like sense of the area. Or you can have a route strategy where you're following a particular path by knowing egocentrically where they are relative to you. So turn left at the church would be a kind of a route strategy. Go north 3 miles, thinking in terms of absolute metric distances and angles would be conducive to a survey strategy. So for example, if you asked, and so males tend to be more attuned to distal landmarks, where the sun is, things that would give you orientation information irrespective of where you are. So a guy might be more likely to say, if you wanted to find the church, go north 3 miles or go towards the mountains, because the mountains will always be there. They'll mark that particular cardinal direction irrespective of small movements by the navigator. A female might be more likely to say, follow the fence, turn right when you get to the barn, and then you'll see it over there on your left. Okay? And when I say would be more likely to, I think everybody uses these local landmarks and egocentric directions. But data from gaze analysis, data from simply asking people directions, data from showing people virtual mazes, manipulating cues, all of these seem to point to this direction, that males are just noticing distal landmarks and celestial markers more than females are. And the reason this has implications for mobility is that they'll both get you to the church. But if you happen to get off the path, if you're in a novel location, you really do need a survey knowledge in order to find your way back home. If you want to take a shortcut, you need a survey knowledge to get back home. So it depends on the kind of movements you're taking. There's no reason to do that if you're simply following a path, and the path is short. Okay. So, as I say, there's a variety of lines of evidence that point to that particular sex difference in navigational style. I'll come back to that later on. I want to go now back to if there is a relationship between navigational challenges and this sex difference in spatial ability. And if navigational challenges, one measure of those is range size. It's certainly not the only one. And it's just the one that most people measure. We also want to think if they're traveling on the path, off the path, and so on. Why? You know, what's the incentive for males? And the second question then is, given that, what is that relationship to navigation and spatial ability? So I'm going to talk about the first of these first. There are several hypotheses out there. There's half a dozen or more. One of the ones that anthropologists will always ask me about is the sexual division of labor. And I can talk about that later, but I'm not going to talk about it now. I tend to think these are primary, partly because they also apply to other species. So the first of these is a mating competition argument, saying that males will get fitness benefits from traveling farther. And the evidence for this comes primarily from other species. I think one of the first most convincing cases was Steve Gollan's analysis of congeneric vole species. They were similar because they're voles in a lot of ways. The monogamous voles had small territories that were similar, males and females. When he brought them back into the lab, there was no difference in how they ran mazes. The polygynous species, and there were 2 of them, at least during the breeding season, the males had much larger ranges encompassing the territory of several females. When he brought them into the lab, the males did better at running mazes. It's been now shown for a variety of taxa. There are other reasons, and there are species where females have larger ranges and better spatial ability also, particularly cowbirds, and there's some interesting studies on cowbirds. But you know, you have to think about humans. We are a mildly polygynous species, and we show the signs of it in our bodies and in our behavior. And yet, males don't find mates that way, or do they? I want to say right off the bat here that I'm not assuming that these are conscious strategies. I don't know what the emotional motivator is on the part of males, is some kind of wanderlust. I will be talking about some of the psychological motivators for females when I talk about parental costs. But anyway, I want to see if the evidence at least is consistent with this argument for humans. The second is that I'll talk about later, it's just parental costs. Females, ranging far is great. You get more resources. You find whatever you're looking for, something over the next hill. But it holds costs. You can get hurt. You can get lost. And for various reasons, those costs presumably will fall more heavily on women, particularly reproductive age women. In addition to just simply carrying a kid around, and I feel like Brooke is, case A example for this, and the energetic costs involved, even if, and there's a risk of getting raped, even if all those costs were the same, the fitness costs would be higher just because a kid is more likely to survive if mom's alive than if dad's alive. So, yeah.
Is this not confounded with differences in hunting? Like, wouldn't men also hunt more than women? And so the reason for why they would travel more than women would also be the reasons for why they would hunt more than women?
I think the division of labor ultimately rests largely on parental costs and constraints, which is one reason why I think this is primary to the sexual division of labor. It may well be that pursuit hunting, and there's all different kinds of hunting actually, but pursuit hunting places, it might have later on in evolution added some selective benefit to males. I don't know. If you're Kristen Hawk, you think that hunting's all about mating. So yeah, I don't know. I did say a lot of people talk about the division of labor, and I can talk about it, but I'm not talking about it in this talk. So I'm going to push on. All right. So let's talk about the mating argument first. And the Twi are a great population with which to study this because you've all heard Brooke talk about the Himba. The Twi are like the Himba in terms of mating patterns and mating competition, except they're poorer. They don't have cattle or just a few cattle. But what they do have is a whole lot of extra pair mating, and they're willing to talk about it. It's accepted in a way that it is not in many cultures, okay? And so this work was done by my postdoc, Lane Vashro, and this is a, is my pointer working? Yeah, there we go. This is a Twi woman in all her finery. She's doing a mental rotation task on our touchscreen computer. This is a bit of the habitat. You can see there's a lot of these distal landmarks to navigate by. So we did an earlier study that had a small NEHB. It had a small sample size. Our conclusions were therefore provisional, but I think this was the first case in which we had pulled all of these pieces of the argument together, showing that males ranged farther, at least in annual mobility, that Twi men had better spatial ability on a range of measures, and that mental rotations was associated with range size in men, not women, and that there seemed to be some fitness benefits. What we could show, it was, that they were having children by more women, but we couldn't really show increase in reproductive success. So now I have better data, and that's the data I'm going to show you. This has not yet been published. So 3 hypotheses. Actually, there are going to be 4, but 3. The first is that Twi men occupy larger ranges than women. And we looked at this using 3 types of range size. There's, people travel for different reasons. There's not a single range size measure that will necessarily be the appropriate one. You have to kind of think about what they're doing. But we looked at daily range with GPS tracking. We looked at yearly, annual range. That is really social visiting, because the question asked there was, where have you stayed when you're not at home? When have you, overnights? And so we recorded the number, Lane recorded the number of places that people had stayed, the number of unique locations. And then a cumulative measure of number of places that they lived in is kind of an ordinal scale it also included how many times they had visited them. Second hypothesis was that this sex difference, if we find it, is related to mate search. And so when he was asking about these annual visits, he said explicitly, why did you go there? He also said, irrespective of what they answered, did you have a lover there? You know, not many populations you can do this with, but very nice. You can with the Twe. And the third is, what's the bottom line in terms of kids? Number of children by self-report. So, first hypothesis, do men travel more than women? And I'll go over these slides fairly quickly. I just realized there's not a y-axis here. My apologies for that. And I also should apologize for the color coding of this, the stereotypical color coding, but there it is. We'll call it red and not pink. How's that? For females, and blue for males. This just shows the range size, the number of individuals with this average yearly range. We have a small sample with daily range. Men are traveling twice as far as women with this small sample. But the thing to note also is the large variance with males. Some of these guys are really traveling a long way. The second thing to note is this shows age 20 to decrepitude, I guess, by range. There was a paper by Miner et al. About the Chimani where they made a big point of saying that there was a sex difference only during the mate-seeking years, which supported this argument. That was because among the Chimani, marriage is a constraint on mating. Among the Twe, it seems to be no constraint at all, as far as I can tell, and you can see this sex difference continuing. Same thing with annual travel. Again, this is an underestimate. Males are traveling to about twice as many unique locations. The reason it's an underestimate is because a lot of these places men traveled several times, particularly if they had lovers there. But still, you can see a large variance in the males and the fact that it is throughout the lifespan. Lifetime range, same picture. We had a reasonable sample for annual travel, which is the one that's most of interest if you are thinking about mating opportunities. And anthropologists have a lot of data about mobility. Mostly it's subsistence mobility, foraging mobility. There's very little, actually, about mating ranges. Okay. Do men travel to visit mates? What do they say? 13.5% explicitly said, yeah, I'm going there to see my girlfriend. When he asked explicitly, was there a lover there? Even if you went, you go, why do you go to a bar? You go there to just check things out, have a good time, maybe you get lucky. It's not necessarily first thing on your mind, but it could happen. 24% of those locations were places where men had lovers. One female trip was to visit a lover. Lane was so surprised about this, he asked her why she went there. And she said, I really don't like my husband very much, and he just won't leave. So, so she had to go. That was the story with her. Men with lovers visited more places than men without lovers. The sex difference drops by half if you exclude trips to lovers. The places with lovers were more likely to be visited many times. It seems that this weight of evidence is really, really strong, that at least among this polygynous population, yeah, guys are traveling to get mates. Does it pay off? It could be just the losers that are doing it, right? Although he doesn't think so. In this case, we now have enough data to say that at every scale, males are having more children the farther they range. So I think this is the most conclusive data thus far to show that this pattern is at least consistent with this mating competition argument and occurs for humans also. I'm less convinced about the spatial data, but I will point out that this is a mental rotation. Mental rotation is the ability to kind of mentally rotate an object in your mind and know what it's going to look like. And it is used all the time, partly because it shows the largest sex difference. In some measures, it's about a standard deviation between the means of males and females. This is not a small difference. What its relationship is to navigation is a subject that we are actually looking at. I don't think it's a slam dunk that it's calling on the same cognitive processes. And in fact, they're correlated, but there's also evidence that there's differences. But everybody looks at it, and so we devised our own method. And it looks like there's a relationship with males but not females, which is exactly what you'd expect if selection is acting on males. The same thing was found in a study in Montreal. There was a sex difference in mental rotations with the males, but not with, and range size with males, but not females. Okay, so Tway men travel farther than women. Mate searching explains a lot of this difference, and it seems to pay off in terms of reproductive success. It may also be related to spatial ability. I'm holding that one with a kind of a light hand. Okay, so far so good, but the Tway are kind of a weird population, you have to admit. And mating patterns are highly variable across humans. We would expect, surely, that male behavior would respond facultatively to that variation. And so the next question is, what about a society where mating competition is very low? All right. So one of our populations, the Maya, is just such a case. And so here, it's an N of 2, okay? Talk to me in 2 years and I'll have maybe an N of 6. But right now I have an N of 2. This study, the data were collected by Karen Kramer and Rusty Greaves. Helen Davis worked on the analysis. And these guys, they are the kind of alpha and omega of mating competition. You already know about the Tway. This is Rusty with a group of Maya women. I don't know what they're laughing about. I'm sure it isn't that mental rotation task because nobody liked doing it. But in any case, the Maya, let me tell you about the Maya. Everybody gets married, but they get married once, all right? If a girl gets pregnant, she gets married. I asked Karen, well, what about divorce? She said that there is no divorce, period. There is just no divorce. So I said, well, you know, so, because men are more likely to remarry after divorce. What about after a death? Maybe men are more likely to remarry after a death. She says nobody gets, there was one case, and she's worked there for years, where there was a remarriage by a male. And it's really hard to know about extra-pair paternity, but as near as she can tell, it is really, really, really low. One way to formalize this, in addition to just that ethnographic information and demographic information that she has, is to think about reproductive variance. And I've just included here the 4 societies that we are including in our study. But if you look at, well, Betzig, there are 2 compilations of variance in reproductive success, one by Betzig, and the Maya show a smaller male reproductive variation than even the hunter-gatherers in the sample, and they're agriculturalists. It is really low. It's the same for men and women. Male and female reproductive interests are really similar in this population. Okay. So what you predict, then, is that you would not get a sex difference in range size, at least when people are mate-seeking, in the Maya, the way you do with the Tway. And that's exactly what we find here. This is based on the same measure of lifetime mobility. It's not the best measure. It's just the only Maya data that I have. I don't have yearly visiting data. And anyway, I could nowhere ask them, did you have a lover there? I suggested that to Karen, actually, and she sort of got pale in the face at the thought of asking them that question. But there is no sex difference here before marriage, you know? And where you start to see, and there's no significant, if you average over ages, sex difference. You do see a small sex difference here with males ranging farther after they have kids. So what's that about? You know, we looked at the places that were on our list for this lifetime. This is regional travel, okay? And It looked like what the men were doing was going to places where they could get resources and bring them back. It seemed more like provisioning than anything else. And so we took another look at Karen's behavior observation data that she had collected earlier from a different sample. And these are just percent of times in and out of camp. Among unmarried people, both males and females are spending about the same amount of time in camp. Once they start getting married and having kids, the women are more likely to stay home, consistent with the parenting hypothesis. I guess the men are more likely to be out and about. Presumably, it could be in the fields. Again, we think it's more like provisioning. And this was not something we expected. We expected female mobility with children to decline. We hadn't really thought about male mobility increasing because of provisioning, but that is what it looks like with the Maya data. Okay, so my summary of this is that among the Tway, sex differences in range size do seem to be driven by male mate seeking. Not just consistent with it, but motivated by it. Among the Maya, this isn't the case, as you'd expect. Male and female reproductive interests are similar, and to the extent that there's any sex difference in range size, it has to probably do with provisioning. It's in the Middle Ages. Investment in parenting. And so my provisional argument to is mobility calibrated to the degree of mating competition is yes. I don't think that's the only source of variation we're going to see. We're also looking at environmental differences like patchiness, but I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, so let me turn now to my second hypothesis about parenting costs. And this one has not received very much direct testing in the literature. We're just starting to look at some of the implications of that for different stages in a woman's reproductive career. But one inference from it is really interesting when you think about female psychology that might motivate this kind of behavior. And that is that, as Ann Campbell has documented, and it's consistent through a lot of literature, women are more fearful than men. They are more harm avoidant than men. And I don't yet know if this is actually true. I will tell you, we've got a student now who's going to study it and find out. I actually talked to him about it. He kept referring to it as the baby tossing study, which is going to have to get a new name once it goes to the IRB. But I think we're going to find it because Janine Stefanucci, my collaborator, has shown, she's looked at perceptual biases, like if you're looking down a slope, a sort of fearful thing. People tend to overestimate slopes, overestimate heights under that kind of arousal. She has known for a long time that this response is stronger in females than males. She's never known how to explain it until she thought in terms of evolution, because she didn't come from that tradition. And now I keep nagging her to try and get that out there. So I think we'll probably find that there's some truth to this too. I think our control is going to be tossing a ball up in the air. So the argument then is that women are more, and we know that women are more risk averse in particular with physical risks, not with all kinds of risks. And so this, in terms of fear of travel, would motivate a woman then to stay closer to home, to just prefer to be home. We have found this spatial anxiety in every field site that we've looked at thus far. I guess since I've got the slide up, I'll tell you what's in it, and then I'll carry on about it. We mostly have just asked a short version of this set of questions on a 1 to 3 scale, basically. This one I'm putting up here just because we've got 10 questions. This is from the Hadza, and Lane collected these data also this summer. So the first 5 of these are questions about getting lost of one sort or another. A sample question: when you are someplace you don't know well, are you concerned about getting lost? The last set are other things that could happen to you while you're out there. Do you worry that an animal could attack you while you're out in the bush? Questions like that. On every single question, females are more fearful. And again, I think we've found this in every society. There are questionnaires that have found it in Western society. I think in contrast to the facultative argument about mating ranges, I'm not sure this is going to be that facultative, because women are always going to be more heavily invested in children than males are. All right. Right, this is my reminder to put in a good word for fear here, because it gets no respect at all. Everybody likes bravery. Nobody wants to be a wimp. And with our evolutionary hat on, we know this is crazy. This is kind of a meme. You can type why women live longer than men and get a whole bunch of pictures of men doing absolutely, completely nutty things. And so, yeah, we admire them, but from an evolutionary perspective, crazy. You want to calibrate it just right. There are benefits, there's costs. There was an article in the Christmas issue of the British, what was it, British Medical Journal? Can't remember what it was called. It was a real study, but slightly tongue-in-cheek, called the Darwin Awards, Sex Differences in Idiotic Behavior. And the point was that, the Darwin Awards are these awards given to people who improve the gene pool by removing themselves from it in spectacularly idiotic, risk-prone ways. And they were pointing out that 90% of the Darwin Award winners were guys. So let's, when I talk about fear, I'm not being pejorative. All right. I'm going to just talk about one study. We're looking at it in a lot of different ways. This one, however, pulls together a lot of different threads that we're looking at. And so the person who took the lead on this is Kyle Gagnon. Sarah Creamer-Gare and Janine Stefanucci are my two dear psych colleagues. They're my main co-PIs on this project. And Kyle now got his PhD. This was part of it. We call it the packet study. What we did, I guess before I go over there, is just tell you, we're doing a lot of different studies in the lab, mostly virtual navigation studies. And so with all these studies, because these are college students, and they'll do what you ask them to do, I'm still trying to get used to the joys of working with the psych subject pool. It's just wonderful as an ethnographer. But they... Every time somebody gives them a study, we say, okay, fill out this batch of questionnaires. And so we have a reasonable sample. And this batch of questionnaires includes the following: a really crude measure of range size, just how many places out of this list of places have you been to? Most of them in Utah. Some of them were different regions of the US. We've now added to the questionnaire to find out who was actually navigating to get there, which is pretty important. We've got a harm avoidance questionnaire. You're posed two kind of unpleasant options. One of them's unpleasant because it's risky. The other's unpleasant for other reasons. It's onerous, painful, whatever. Which would you choose? There's a reason why I looked at harm avoidance in addition to spatial anxiety, which I'll tell you in a minute. And some established questionnaires. One is the survey and route distinction that I mentioned earlier. A questionnaire about spatial anxiety and self-assessed navigation ability, which has, to some extent, it's how good males think they are versus females, but it's also been validated. The reason I wanted to look at harm avoidance was because I was interested in what was causing what. And the problem with spatial anxiety is it could go both ways. You could have somebody who's spatially anxious, and so they don't go very far because they're concerned about getting lost. You could also have somebody who, for whatever reason, other kinds of constraints, or maybe they're just following their GPS too much, doesn't have much of a range, or at least is not experienced navigating. And because of that, they don't acquire the skills of good navigation and consequently could be anxious just because they have small ranges. And so I wanted to use a questionnaire in addition that was independent of range size, just plain trait harm avoidance. And so our predictions then are that women will be more harm avoidant as well as spatially anxious, and particularly that harm avoidance would mediate the relationship between sex and range size, if we saw a relationship between sex and range size. All right, so that it would be part of the reason why women are traveling less far. And that in turn would have consequences for their style of navigation, that people who range farther would have more of an orientation survey style of navigation, paying attention to, questions like, do you know where north is? If you just immediately left the building. That they would also have a better sense of direction, and that this would also lead to less spatial anxiety. And so this still needs a little bit of work, but this is the path model that Kyle worked up. So I'll just take you through it. Males are I guess I'll stand behind the podium. Males are 1 here, so that this is a positive relationship, meaning that males have larger ranges by our crude measure. This is a Utah study, so it's a weird population in the Henrich sense, and maybe other senses, I don't know. Whoops. Females are more harm avoidant, that's a negative sign, and harm avoidant individuals then also have smaller ranges. And this is a partial mediation, which supports indirectly, I think, an inference from the parenting model. In turn, ranges, people with large ranges tended to have more of a survey strategy of navigation, which was negatively associated with spatial anxiety, positively associated with self-assessed sense of direction, all right? We didn't see much with route strategy. People talk about females relying more on routes. We tend to think that there's not much of a sex difference in that. Everybody uses those kinds of cues. All right, so that kind of pulls together the pieces. And just to, excuse me, wrap up and tell you just the headlines of some of the other studies we're working on and questions we've asked. One is a question about exploration. People don't normally look at exploration, but you might expect that if women are more fearful, they would explore more cautiously. And Carl Gagnon wanted to know this, and so he set up this very, very large, realistic-looking virtual world. And it was easy to get lost in it. The men, I actually watched some people traveling around in it, and I watched Larry Sugiyama traveling around in it, actually, and he picked up the joystick, and it was kind of like, yee-haw, and just took off running, really long step lengths with guys. And the women did it was more of a kind of a home base circling back, more of what Kyle called revisiting. We were able to track these movements. And the people that did more revisiting across sexes were also more harm avoidant, which suggests that it is in fact a cautious style of navigation. It also mediated skill at navigating back. What he had people do is he said, I've hidden some objects in this space, go find them. So they just took off, virtually that is, and looked for them. And then they had to go back from another location to try and find them again. And people who had more of a, I guess, longer step length before they stopped or retreat or turned around were more successful at finding the objects. Ian Ruginski wanted to know, what about if you make people anxious? We've looked at people who are more and less anxious. And what he did here was his manipulation was to have people breathe in through a straw. The control was a large straw. The experimental group was a small straw, and this is apparently very anxiety-provoking because you're not getting enough air. And what he found was that it affected the navigation performance, particularly of women. And he also found that because these guys had been given the packet, that people who had ranged farther also seemed to have a protective effect in the anxiety condition, which is kind of interesting. Mariah Shug and a lot of us are interested in knowing whether childhood exploration might mitigate some of these sex differences, whether it might matter. And if NSF gives me money this time around, I'm going to be able to answer that question. We're going to be looking at middle childhood, I hope. I think it matters. People in this country have gotten very weird about letting kids roam unsupervised. And there has been a kind of a backlash called the free-range kids movement. You know, people my age, you know, our parents didn't always know where we were. You know, we walked to school. Yeah. And now, you know, somebody will call Child Protective Services on you if the kids are 2 blocks away. This is really unheard of. It is off the scale cross-culturally because in traditional societies, kids are allowed to just wander as soon as they can walk. And so we're curious to know what the implications of this rather unusual child-rearing pattern are for spatial ability. And we're also going to look at environmental variation. So those are some other things that the group is doing. General conclusions, because I've talked about a lot of different things. In all the sites that we've looked at thus far, this may not be true for the Chumani, but Helen hasn't yet analyzed her Chumani data. Males are ranging farther, and they are less spatially anxious. Yes, I think there's support for the argument that male mating competition leads to a sex difference in mobility, with the caveat that its relative importance varies facultatively with mating patterns, at least with my N of 2. And judging by the Utah study and some evidence from some of our other studies, it looks like harm avoidance might really matter as a motivator for women. In that study, remember, it mediated the sex difference in mobility, which then affected navigational style and ability. And we have some evidence relating range size and spatial ability in males, not females. Again, I'm not sure about that one yet, but then I've got 2 more years to run on this grant, so maybe I'll be able to nail that one down in a couple of years. Let me thank the SCAN group, who's responsible for all of this, and NSF for funding it. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, when women travel, so when Himba women travel, because I did mobility recalls too, it seems to be really reproductively linked. So they're traveling largely back to their natal homes, and so those are known landmarks. And I'm wondering if you've looked at all sort of comparing. I guess you could do this by comparing their lifetime history versus their annual history, or something like what percentage of the places they go are familiar places.
Familiar places, yeah. Yeah, well, one thing we're going to do is to look at those GPS tracks and not just measure range size, which is the only data I've got now. What really matters is, again, how navigationally challenging is it? And so that's why I've got geographers on the team, and there are ways we can look at that. But for example, the Pume, their foraging ranges are similar for males and females, but that's because the females are going on one of their resources is mangoes. It's on the river, and you know, Rusty says it's just if you tracked it, it would be a straight line there and back. Whereas the males are hunting and doing all kinds of unpredictable movements. So yeah, I think range size the range size is useful because everybody measures it, but it's really just a proxy for what we're interested in. As to the other side of what you were saying about why women are moving, the women seem to be moving for family. You know, in the one of the things that Lane was completely counterintuitive as far as the parenting hypothesis goes is that the nursing women are actually, they're spatially anxious, but they're traveling more, not less, and they're traveling to visit potential alloparents probably. Anything else? Yeah.
So the questionnaire packet for the Utah subjects.
Yeah.
So it didn't include anything about like mating orientation.
You know, it's because of my collaborators just kind of flinched at the idea of using the SOI, which is what we would have used, and so we had some kind of something in there about, you know, are you single, are you not? But to throw against everybody that was doing anything, it just seemed a little much. That said, one of our studies, it's actually an undergraduate who's spearheading it, is a study where we're putting GPSs on people in Utah for a week, and we're also collecting genetic data, looking at DRD4 and maybe some other interesting loci. And those guys are getting questions about sexuality. And so I'll be able to find out the answer to that maybe in a year. Yeah, it's interesting, but people hesitate to ask questions like that. Evolutionary psychologists are so used to handing these things out to everybody, but I would love to know.
Squeamish.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
So the question of risk-taking and things like this in the sex differences and those things, and you said that you thought that it might be less adjustable in women.
That's my guess.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious what you think about sort of, so it seems to me in the Schwar where I work in South America, that almost everyone there is more risk-taking. Like if you were to map the sort of distribution of risk-taking,
yeah.
right, like kids, women, adult men are, Americans look like we're totally everything compared to virtually everyone there. But then the question would be something like, because the cases where I've noticed where I would say there's no way I would let that spider run over my body, right?
Yeah, right.
They know that the spider's not going to hurt them.
I know. I was like that with snakes.
Yeah, so I wonder. I mean, there's the question of sort of.
Yeah, no, they're really aware of snakes, but it's part of daily life.
Exactly,
So
right. I mean,
I remember seeing a bunch of women just, there were birds twitter, and they said, oh, they see a snake. I mean, I was dumb to snakes, but yeah.
Well, also you have women that would just walk up to a snake with a machete and chop its head off.
Right. So here's the thing. I would be astonished if there were not cross-cultural differences in sort of modal fear level and possibly in what people are afraid of. I don't know. But I would be really surprised if the Schwar, we'll find out when Larry Sugiyama gets his data, if the women were not more fearful than the men, even so.
Well, that I would guess that's probably true. But okay, yeah.
So, yeah.
That's probably. I just want one brief follow-up though.
Yeah.
So one thing in thinking about what would mediate this sort of the facultative adjustment of it is, one thing is kind of experience, right? So
That's right.
individually realize, okay, I've done this before and it
That's
didn't
right.
come out badly, or I've seen. But then there's the other.
Yeah, it's not just the amygdala. You got some other things going on to kind of tamp it down and say, okay, this is okay. This is how I handle it, right?
Yeah, and then the other thing which you sort of alluded to with the cultural changes in the United States is things about ideology. I mean, in particular, parenting ideologies, right? Like you have to protect your child. You're a bad parent if you don't do that. And some of those things seem to be. People don't actually have a very good estimate of what the risk is of leaving the light socket untaped. Or, I mean, how do they know?
I've just been reading Kahneman's book on fast and slow thinking, and people are terrible for all the reasons he points out. Less so, presumably, in a bush environment, you would think. Well, there's less evolutionary novelties, probably better honed. Yeah. One question, of course, is this. I said that there's a large sex difference in range size in kids, and there is. And you might ask, well, maybe that's just because females are more protective of their daughters. It's not just that. The cross-cultural study found it with task behavior, but also self-directed behavior. And one of the studies in the U.S. asked about how far your parents would let you go, and they would tell them, and then he would say, but to the boys, but that was back there, and you're already further. And she said, oh, the boys would say, she knows I do this, it's okay. So it's as though they're just not taking it very seriously. I don't know if it's a wanderlust that just wanting to see what's over the next hill, what it is. The other side of that, though, and something that I think deserves another look, is that this has been framed in the kind of negative. Females don't like to travel. Females are afraid of traveling. What he asked those kids also was, tell me about your favorite places. And everybody mentioned, exciting places to go, the waterfall, various things like that. A lot of the girls, but only the girls, also said my room. So I think there's a kind of positive liking for home that females have, and people just haven't looked at that. You know, it's not just that we're afraid to travel, we just really like it at home. Yeah.
You're talking about mean differences between males and females, but you also showed that there's a lot of range.
Yeah.
As a woman who likes to see the map,
Yeah.
it makes me
Me
wonder,
too.
what information can you gather from that variance? Are there other things that correlate with your variance on your measures?
We need to look at that, and again, the only population yet where we have looked at that is the Twi. And you know, what we were expecting was that women who are pregnant and nursing would not be traveling as far, that women post-reproductively would be traveling farther. That last is a prediction of Sherry and Hampson, who came at it from noticing that estrogen seemed to suppress spatial ability. And so their expectation was that estrogen during the reproductive years was an approximate reason for why females were not traveling as far, and that those constraints would be lifted in a woman postmenopausally when her estrogen drops, and therefore her spatial ability would, if not get better, at least not deteriorate as much. And it's kind of mixed, is what I can say. I don't have enough data to answer that, but it's a really important question, and it's actually something we might look at here. We could actually do that with MTurk, because we're starting an MTurk study. We're doing an MTurk study on sex differences in spatial attention. And one thing that astonished me, I mentioned this at Marty's, was that a huge number of those women, in fact, are pregnant. Because who else would sit down there and do some little, task at home on MTurk? So they talk about the demographics of the MTurk population in order to support the argument that actually it's a reasonable population. That I think nobody realizes how many of those women are nursing and pregnant. And so we could easily give them different kinds of spatial tasks, I think, and answer some of these questions.
Do you think there's any trade-off with the old women are better at language, men are better at spatial, or women are more social?
Well, the sex difference in spatial ability is more robust, larger in magnitude than any other cognitive sex difference. The verbal thing, well, females are better at some verbal tasks. In terms of social, it depends what you mean by social. It was one of those things that Maccabee and Jacqueline looked at back in the 70s. And they're just a different kind of sociality. I mean, little boys run around in packs, and anybody can join if they respect rank, and girls are in little 2s and 3s, and kind of exclude outsiders. I don't know that one's more social. There is some evidence that females are better at detecting facial expressions other than anger. Men are really good at cueing in on that. I think it's more qualitative than more and less. It does speak to the question of what's the cost? Why wouldn't everybody have good spatial ability? And I just have to assume that there probably is a cost, because in some species, you see the sex difference isn't there outside the breeding season. So, Gallen's polygynous voles, meadow voles, you only see it in the breeding season. And there are species, too, where the hippocampus just seasonally gets larger and smaller, at least in birds. Of course, birds have small brains. I think it's more, though, that so there may be a cost, I don't know, but I think it's more that there's just not the need for it, not the pressure for it. I mean, I'm assuming that men and women can both get where they need to go reasonably efficiently. It's just that if you are doing the kind of travel that we are supposing that men are more likely to do, you need that extra increment. Yeah.
So I know you said you were not going to talk about this in the course of the talk,
But no, yeah, so now.
but I am very interested in what role population density is playing in these dynamics. So, I mean, do you think it is the sort of thing where if, your range is just inundated with people and, presents a ton of mating opportunities in a more constrained area, are you going to see less, smaller ranges for the males? And do you think it's sort of...
I don't know, maybe we should compare the LA area with, Pomona or something. Yeah, I bet not. I mean, do you travel less because, I don't mean you personally, because, the density of population. I think it's a really, really interesting question about why people go where they go. And I think in most cases, it's not an explicit motive for finding mates, and the way in which people do find mates is often culturally affected. I feel like I should wash my mouth out with soap for saying something's culturally constructed, but there it is. The Maya, they find their mates in the village. They've known these people forever. They don't necessarily have to find them, at least in the traditional society, elsewhere. One thing that I do think matters for mobility is probably resource patchiness, because in the tropical forests, things are a lot more. I don't know the tropics. I work in savannas, but it's more. And so, tropical people can correct me, but I think of it as more homogeneous. There's this species here, that species there, that species there, and then you sort of repeat. So there's really no reason, at least in terms of resources, why you'd go very far over there, because it's just more of what you can get over here, which is really, really different than, say, Bushmen, where you have to go many miles to get to the mongongo groves, but you have to stay here for the water and so on. And so genetic data supports that expectation in that there is more population structure, the FST data, more population structure, more boundedness than in the forests. And so that being the case, I would expect smaller sex differences perhaps in range size in the forest just because of patchiness. I hadn't thought about population density, but that would probably, I guess it depends, because with population density you also often get economic development. With economic development you get roads. It would be really hard to disaggregate those. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, you mentioned resources, patchiness. I'm wondering, as far as, travel not only to secure mates, but to maintain social networks.
Yeah.
If you live in a marginal environment where, environmental perturbations could put you and your family on the edge of being able to make it, it seems like travel to maintain social networks.
Exactly.
That would seem to play a really important role as well.
I think so. Barry Hewlett, who was the sort of pioneer in looking at what you might call mating ranges, called them exploration ranges. And we can also call them social visiting ranges, and I completely agree. I mean, it's not just about having a mate there, but you go for women were more likely to go to visit kin. So you go for various kinds of social reasons, social ties, and you have a girlfriend there or meet one, even if it's not the main motive. Certainly that was the case in the Kalahari, where I did field work. I mean, people have ties everywhere because you need them. I was at one place, one water hole, and and this is a function of marriage. I was at one water hole, and there was a whole camp basically visiting, because the guy had married into that camp. And people said, and it, the kid wasn't even his kid. Everybody knew that too. Marriage is too important to be just left to mating. And everybody knew that they're here for the water, because this was a really scarce area. And people also had, ties up on the river. So no question, it's the source of security. Yeah. Yeah.
So, one question I was sort of wondering as we were going through all this is, within a village and, in Twi society, is there stigma against extramarital pairings within that village, or is it okay for that to occur?
The person to ask is Lane, and I guess if you can speak to the Himba about that, it's probably still relevant. My sense is that there's not a stigma to it as long as you behave appropriately, and as Brooke said, don't stay for tea in the morning.
Yeah, I think, the Twi, I think, are more sedentary, right? And so the Himba it's sort of like a household compound, right? And it certainly would be okay if, you live in this compound and your lover comes from the compound just down the road kind of thing. That's certainly happens all the time. Their residential structure is a little bit differently.
Well, they've recently been aggregated, so it's kind of hard
So
to
they just
answer
kind of-
that
they go to
question.
camps like that.
The government, I think, did it to make food drops easier
Right.
over the last just few years.
Yeah, so I don't, I mean, I don't, but before that, they were living basically in the same kind of structure that the Hippo were, and my guess is it's gonna be the same. But whether this throwing everybody in together makes a difference, my guess is no, but I don't know.
Just behave decently, you know, get out early in the morning. Yeah.
So I think we agree that what we're talking about is a predisposition as an adaptation, right? Like given that you travel a great distance, your navigational ability will improve.
I'm sure there's learning. At least that's my reason for limiting my use of my GPS nowadays.
We certainly see those gross
Yeah.
differences from culture to culture.
Well, we also know, of course, from the taxi driver study and other studies that experience makes a difference. The hippocampus is a plastic organ.
And that then we're talking about this being a greater capacity possibly in men than in women. So it seems, maybe this was in your analysis and I missed it, but it seems like a good analysis is controlling for range in a population, like of the men that range X amount and women who range X amount, what are their navigational or spatial abilities like?
That's a really good idea, and I don't know if we've looked at that. Yeah. I mean, there's a classic study on kids which found that, you know, whether you were girls or boys, you know, that there was a relationship between traveling farther and having good spatial ability. But to find the girls who were, in fact, more mobile would be a useful thing to do. One of our lab studies is a virtual navigation task where she's looking at proximate cues and distal cues, a classic paradigm that points to this route versus survey thing I was talking about. It also was modeled on a water maze, so this is also a sex difference, by the way, that is not just unique to humans. And she found, as I remember, that women who had large ranges actually were just as good at navigating in this maze as the men were, but that the girls who did not have large ranges weren't. So I don't know how much of that is inclination. It's really hard to tease it out, but you know, we should be getting enough data that we should be able to do that across sites. In terms of inclination, I don't know the male mind, you know. I do know that well, if there's a blank spot on the map, my husband really wants to go there. I'll go there if there's a bird refuge or something to see. I think there's something going on there. Back when I was a graduate student and a student of Lou Binford's, I remember a conversation I had with him in the courtyard, and I had just learned behavioral ecologies, and I'm all full up to here with costs and benefits, and talking about the costs of moving and travel. And he looks at me and says, well, I don't think mobility is a cost, he said. And I'm thinking, what are you talking about? How can it not be a cost? And he said, well, he was working with a Nunamute at the time. He says, when I asked his male informant why he goes over there, he said, I go there because when I'm over here, I don't know what's going on over there. And, you know, I didn't know what to make of it, but for some reason it just stuck in my brain and reappeared several decades later as I'm thinking about this stuff, thinking, okay, maybe that's what's going on. Maybe part of it is information costs and it's just a yen to find out. Yeah.
So in Australia, when I was working with the Māori, they don't have words for left and right. So all verbal directions are told with the cardinal directions. So I'm wondering how that might map out onto...
There's a wonderful, fascinating literature. There are a lot of societies that, that will tell you that, you know, the paper is, I don't know, I'll show my ignorance, which way's north, but, you know, in reference to the plate, something, you know, the plate is north of the silverware or something. And People who look at that literature claim that it is simply linguistic, absolutely purely cultural. I find it impossible to believe that there are not behavioral consequences to it, and I would dearly love to find out what they are.
Because you would expect less sex difference, right? Because if
Yeah, you might, or you might. So in the case of the Faroe Islands, distal cues are everywhere, and what Mariah found was that everybody uses distal cues more in terms of orient strategy. So the women there might be like American males, but there was still a sex difference. This distinction, though, is something I did look at. I spent a month in Tonga where they do have terms for left and right, but there's a little animals in a row task, which I can tell you about because it's cute and easy to describe. So you give people maybe 3 or 4 animals, right? And you say, okay, I'm going to arrange these on a table. Watch how I do it. Maybe the horse is here, the pig's there, the cow's there, whatever. And then you tell them to remember, you scoop them up, and they're facing this orientation, right? And then you turn them around like this and give them the animals and say, arrange them in the same way. And Americans, if the cow is on the left, the cow's going to be on the left this way. Societies like you're talking about are more inclined, if the cow is facing north, the cow's going to be facing north. All right? It's a more allocentric, geocentric reference point, whereas ours is a more egocentric reference point. And so I was curious to know what they did in Tonga, and so I did the animals in a row task there. And what I found was that outside, everybody was allocentric. If the cow was north, it was north no matter how you did it. When I did it inside, it was 50-50. And I have yet to figure out which 50. But it was not based just on sex. So I think there is something spatial, something functional, something real about that distinction. It may not be the origin of it, but it might just be a consequence of it. So that's on the list, down the way. Okay, thanks.